Hello, everyone. Let me just take a seat here. Hope you're doing well today. I have something that I think is going to be interesting because it's a question that I imagine you've probably asked yourself or have thought about in our context anyway, because in our region of New Jersey, right, we aren't in a part of the United States or part of the world where Christians are kind of the assumed majority of people, and we are surrounded by people that celebrate a bunch of different holidays and things like that. And so I thought that it would be interesting to talk about something because yesterday was Eid. Um, and Eid is a holiday that marks the end of the Muslim period of Ramadan, and so it's their holy month of the year. And in that holy month, they uh, kind of they fast, they remember things about the life of Muhammad and stuff like that. I'm not gonna. This isn't about Eid. Well, it's about Eid, but it's not about what Eid talks about. Rather, I wanted to look at like as a Christian, can you wish people Eid Mubarak, which is like Merry Christmas basically, or Happy Eid, or it means Blessed Eid in Arabic. So can you wish a friend Eid Mubarak? Like if they say it to you. So for instance, right, we like yesterday in Eid we had um, in our young adults group, we had a Muslim guy come, and he's in the group. Like he comes to our Bible studies and stuff, but he wanted to do a presentation about Islam, and so we said, sure, yeah, you can come down and we can kind of break fast and talk and about Islam and Christianity, and it was really good. I really appreciated that. Right. Um, but like in your own personal life or in at larger times, should we be wishing people uh, like other holidays like Happy Hanukkah or Happy Eid or um, uh, Blessed Holi or whatever it is in Hinduism, right? Holi or Holi. I can't really pronounce it well. But should we be doing that? That's a really good question, and it's interesting because the Bible. I mean, in when it comes to this specific case, there isn't really any um, uh, equivalent, right? We don't have Paul saying, "Oh, it's okay to wish your pagan neighbors happy Saturnalia" or something like that, right? Yo Saturnalia, but we also don't. We also have this is where it might be interesting, right? We do have injunctions against worshiping pagan gods, like in the Old Testament, and things like that. And so I wanted to talk about like, is it okay? And if this is something you've thought about, you aren't the first people to think about this. Um, so, for instance, I went online, and this is just a website called Naraland. It's like a Nigerian forum, and for those of you who don't know, Nigeria is like a country that is, I want to say it's like 60-40 or 70-30 Christian Muslim. There's a very large Muslim population in Nigeria. Most of sub-Saharan Africa is largely Christian. The northern Africa is largely Muslim, but Nigeria is kind of in the middle, and there's lots of tension and things like that. And so this is a forum where they're talking about whether or not it's okay for Christians to wish Muslims Happy Eid or Eid el Mubarak, right? And you have a lot of people on here who are disagreeing or have different opinions about whether or not, right? People say, "Oh, you do that, you are saying that you believe in Allah," and stuff like that. Um, and some people say, "No, there's no problem with it." So there's a lot of debate about this in cultures where that's a reality, right? Uh, I want to look at these few Bible verses, and I'm not going to read articles because you guys can read them yourselves. I can link them in the description. But I found it interesting to kind of look at different responses. And so I want to talk about what's probably, you know, understanding that I could be wrong about this, but what I would say is appropriate in our personal life and what's appropriate in statements that a church makes, right? Like a national body or it's a group of people that represent a larger faith people, right? Like a bishop or something. So, or in our case, our church's our denomination's Facebook page, right? But first, I want to look at just these few Bible verses, so these are going to set the scene. So we have Mark 2:15 through 17. It says, while Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said to them, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Now, this is the reason I chose this is because one of the ways that Muslims celebrate Eid is they have iftar feasts at the end of the day because they fast while while the sun is up. And so they break their fast a big meal at the end of the day. It's actually kind of funny. Most Muslims actually gain weight during Ramadan, and that's not because they're not fasting, right? They faithful ones do the hours, but they have these huge meals at the end of the day, right? So you have a little meal or a meal before you wake up, but like before the day starts at like 5:30 or 6 a.m. before the sun is up, and you pack a lot of calories into that, and then you pack a bunch of calories into the meal at night, right? And so you actually gain weight for a lot of people, which is kind of funny, but that's just how it goes. But the reason I talk about that is because oftentimes they'll invite their neighbors to go, and so some Christians will be like, oh, well, am I able to go to iftar or like some stuff like that? They aren't religious in nature, at least the ones I've been to, right? I've been to iftars before. It's just like a meal that people have. So here we see Jesus eating with people who aren't believers, right? Who are sinners. I think that is a good reminder to us that like we don't have to surround ourselves only with Christians all the time. It's especially going to be important when we talk about a verse that comes up later. So just keep that in mind. Paul in 1st and 2nd Corinthians has a lot to say on this, especially 1st Corinthians. So there's this. He says in 1 Corinthians 9 through 13, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral, or the greedy, or swindlers, or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave this world. But now I am writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or a sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or slanderer, a drunkard or swindler. Not even eat with such people. What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked person from among you. So this is really helpful when we talk about judging people and judgment in the church and discipline. Right here, we can see it's clearly allowed. It's fine. Right, we are able to judge, and we are able to judge morally, just things that happen. Right, Paul's not saying that, but what he's saying here is he's saying that you aren't banned from associating people outside of the church who are these things. Right, and in our case, when it comes to talking about other religions, idolaters is important, right? People who don't believe that God is God and Jesus Christ is God, all that sort of stuff. So he doesn't say, oh, you can't talk or associate with them at all, right? That's not what he's saying here. This would be if someone came into the church and began to meld these things or to preach another gospel, stuff like that, then you don't associate with them. But that's very different from our public kind of life with people, in our work or something like that, right? Because he says here, if that was the case, we wouldn't be able to do anything. And I think that that's a wise teaching, and obviously, because it's in the Bible, God ordained. So this is another verse from 1 Corinthians 10:27. It says, if an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions or conscience. So right there, right, because something that's going on in the Corinthian church is they're actually kind of having a debate, not dissimilar to this one. They're debating about whether or not it's okay to eat food that's been sacrificed to idols, which is very common, especially meat at the time, right? You would usually kill the animal in service of a sacrifice, and then you would take that meat and eat it. And so for some Christians, that's a little too bothering to the conscience. And so Paul says, hey, that's fine, right? If you don't want to eat it, you don't have to. But he says it doesn't matter if it is or not, because really those things have no power. And so this is where he says, if you go, don't feel like you have to uh, uh, not eat it or whatever. You can. And again, I think this applies to our lives in many ways, but certainly to the situation here, right, where it comes to like, oh, can I go or celebrate with a family, a Hindu family, for example, knowing that this is food that maybe they've dedicated to a god or whatever, or something like that, or an Indian restaurant. I don't know. You can. It's not a big deal. If it bothers your conscience, you certainly don't need to do it, right? I think that that's kind of at the really cool thing at the level that Paul talks about, is he talks about personal conscience. He does say that really the mature person is able to kind of work past that, but if it does bother your conscience, then by no means do you have to partake. So anyway, right there again, we have this idea of being invited to a meal, and it's okay to go. Last one is 2 Corinthians 6:14-18. And this is going to be interesting because you might think that depending on how you take this, it might be a complete rebuttal of what he's just said. So I want to talk about it in context and also see how what Paul's warning against here is important to be warned against, and what it looks like and how we can avoid it. So one of the things he talks about in 2 Corinthians is this warning against idolatry. So this is what he says. He says, do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? Belial is like a demonic name, or one of the names for Satan. There's debate about it. Or what does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will live with them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Therefore, come out from them and be separate, says the Lord. Touch no unclean thing, and I will receive you. And I will be a father to you, and you will be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. So, like, right there, if you take this passage without context, which I'm going to give to you, you can think that Paul's being hypocritical, or Paul is double talking here, because it seems like in these previous verses he says it's fine to have dealings and be with people outside of the church who are unbelievers, but here he says don't be yoked with them, and things like that. And so, like, what does this mean? Well, what I want to talk about, or what I want to say here is, I looked at, along with this forum, right? I looked at what I wanted to look at is I wanted to look at a lot of different Christian writings about this in particular, and see how people dealt with this, both in ways that I think are good and ways that I think are not as good. So I looked at a bunch of different writers, and I tried to privilege people who were interacting with Muslims in Muslim contexts. Because obviously, if like you're in the United States and you're in an area where there aren't any Muslims, it's very easy to say or do things, or other religions, right? No, Jews or Hindus or whatever. It's really easy to be like, oh, this is how Christians should act in these circumstances. It's like, well, you don't really have to deal with these circumstances, so it's not very helpful if you kind of just like give these ex cathedra statements about what we should do and what we shouldn't. So I really would like to privilege Christians who are in the Arab countries or in places around there, and like how do they kind of deal with it? Because obviously for Christians in those areas, there's also this fear of persecution, this very real fear of persecution, which I don't want to downplay, which makes them very clear. Like, in some of these countries, this is something like you're not just a Christian because it's what your family does, right? It could be very difficult or dangerous for you to do this, and so you can, when you take on that label, you do so in a way that is really putting yourself in a position where you could be hurt. And I think that that's bold and brave and good, right? I think that Christians should proclaim the gospel even in difficult circumstances. But I think it's more important to hear what they have to say, because they're actually dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, right? Doesn't mean that people in the United States or in other areas of the world can't have interesting claims about this, but I definitely don't think that we should that definitely we should look at how Christians who are in this area work through these issues. So this is a whole article from Christianity Today. It says, should Christians fast during Ramadan with Muslims? Which I guess was a debate. This is from 2009, so quite a while ago. And here they have a few different people, right? Some people say, it's absolutely appropriate, particularly if one does it for spiritual reasons. And these are people who kind of do missions in the Middle East and things like that. And not all people agree, but it says here, the idea of Ramadan, the Feast of Eid, is Muslims are asking that they would encounter God more. What that means to them varies from place to place and person to person, I'm sure. And Islam has so many different manifestations that varies dramatically across the globe. But still, that's something we can agree on. We can agree with, that we pray and get to know God more in order to bridge the gap between East and West, Muslims and Christian cultures, rather than condemning and criticizing. Here's something very easy that we could do as followers of Jesus that's consistent with the teachings of Christ in the scriptures. Not that we're supporting every viewpoint. So there are people who do ministry to Muslims that think that, working with, I wish I don't have a thing, so I can't read you more, but working with Muslims is fine, right? So there are people who say that. This was an interesting one. This is the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary, which is pretty interesting because obviously I actually don't know where they're located. Let me see if I can find that out. I didn't look that up. Let's see, Lebanon. So they're in Lebanon, which is actually one of the more diverse regions in the Middle East when it comes to religion. There is actually a large Christian population there in Lebanon. Lebanon's right north of Israel, if you didn't know. And so here it says, it's a blog post, I guess, on the seminary blog, right? It says, should we wish a blessed Ramadan to our Muslim friends? And there's a whole thing in here, right? And this one guy, Martin Akkad, talks about it, explains a little bit about what it is. And he here talks about sometimes how the Quran talks about Christians, Muslims, which is important. But here he says that we can, right? He says, a third thought that comes to mind is wishing Ramadan Kareem or Ramadan Mubarak to my Muslim friends does not turn me into a Muslim any more than I could persuade myself that a Muslim wishing me a Merry Christmas has converted to Christianity. When my Muslim friend wish me Merry Christmas or Blessed Easter, I do not look down on them as compromisers or as schemers. I simply feel honored and appreciated, and it makes me think highly of them as open-minded Muslims. In the same way, when we wish our friends Ramadan Mubarak, it simply makes us more gracious, better neighbor, and quite frankly, better human beings. And so I'll leave this in the description. It's worth reading. But he definitely says you should go to an iftar if people invite you, right? This is ways of building bridges. And for Muslims or Christians in the Middle East, this is really important because obviously the more bridges you build with them, not in terms of compromising your faith, but just in terms of friendship, you lessen the chances that you're going to be persecuted. He doesn't say that, but I think that that's an obvious side of this. This is one of the ones that I think is interesting. This is the Archbishop Justin Welby of the Anglican Church, and he made a YouTube video, and he said he wished everyone a happy Eid, right? Things like that. And this is where I think it's interesting because unlike these people who are kind of talking about personal life issues, right? Like what can you as an individual Christian here do when something like this happens? This is like someone who's a head of a church making a statement. And it's and so he said, Mr. Welby, like he wishes them an Eid Mubarak. He says that he reiterated the church's love for Muslims as brothers and sisters in humanity while stressing the need to openly acknowledge and discuss the differences the two faiths have. And so there's obviously like lots of debate about this, right? Because this is a church leader. It's different when it's people on the street doing things, but when you come out as a church and say, oh, hey, happy Eid Mubarak, things like that, that's a little bit different because then it seems as though there is a part of the structure that's saying, oh yeah, this is okay to have these types of beliefs and things like that, right? Um, and so there's people that talk about that on here. Lastly, is this one, which is pretty good. This is Andrew Reed. He was a guy who lived. He's Australian, but he lived in Egypt for a very long time, and so he talks a little bit about Eid, and going and making, like, how do you, like, witness to people during Eid. It's actually a pretty good article. I'd recommend that. He also says, hey, go to Iftar if you can, um, and stuff like that. So definitely, like, here there's this push on joining them in their celebrations, even if you don't believe on, not push, but like that it's fine. But I want to, but so a lot of that seems to be in line with like kind of what we've read from First Corinthians and Mark, right? But what do you do against, like, what do you do with Second Corinthians? So like how do we reconcile this, right? Because we can quote this all day, but we also have this, right? And if we're going to hold these two things in tandem, like, how do we deal with that? Well, so Second Corinthians, the main thrust of Second Corinthians is that there's these other teachers that have come in to the Corinthian church. And in the Corinthian church, they have begun leading people to follow another gospel or another way, apart from Paul. And Paul refers to them as like super apostles because apparently they're very good at preaching, right? He uses that, I think, as a negative term, kind of like a funny term, not as like, oh, he's actually recognized that they're apostolic or something like that, right? He's using this as a way of kind of contrasting them with himself because he himself isn't that gifted at speaking and things. And so here, right, this warning is to be on the alert for people who come into the church and lead people astray, right? That we should be very wary of people who can come in and then corrupt the message, right? That's why he would say, don't associate with people in the church in First Corinthians who are like this. That's who he's referring to here in Second Corinthians, right? He's referring to them as unbelievers, and obviously this does have certain implications for us as Christians in our dealings within the church, and wise decisions when it comes to making our own personal life decisions like marriage and stuff like that. That we shouldn't become yoked with people who are different than us in those ways. But he's definitely not saying here that you can't associate with people outside the church who think differently than you. This is very much a in the church, in-house difficulty that's going on, right? What fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? And what this means is the people, this is where I see kind of the rub between the two, right? So I would say that in your personal life, if you are ministering to someone or you're friends with a Muslim, it is perfectly fine to wish them an Eid Mubarak. What is not, in my opinion, okay, is to take a stance as a church and come down on these types of issues that push aside difference, or do not, or lead to the belief that it's all right to disagree about the nature of God in such a serious way, and that there really is no difference. So, for instance, what made me think of this topic was this post that the Peace USA put out yesterday, right? It says, as many across the world bid farewell to the month of Ramadan, join us in sending warm wishes for a beautiful and blessed Eid to all who celebrate Eid Mubarak, right? And so, is it a mean thing to write? Of course not, right? Is it bad, like in the sense of like rude or things are, it's like, do they mean to be bad? No, stuff like that, right? I think that whoever wrote this wants to engender, harmony and stuff like that. But our church generally at the higher levels is very universalist, right? The idea that there doesn't really need to be one true faith, or maybe Christianity is the true faith, but if you don't believe, that's fine. Like, that's generally what it is. I mean, if you don't believe me on this, right? Like, I have proof. I did a whole video actually about a statement that our church did on Muslims and Jews somewhere on our YouTube channel. I'm sure you can find it. It's one of the things that I did at General Assembly, right? I tried to get people to vote against it, and I got absolutely destroyed. Right? I think it was like what 2-36 or something like that. Just dominated. It wasn't even close. And so there is really poor teaching in our denomination about faith and interfaith and comparative religion and stuff like that. And here, I'll give you a good example. So in our Book of Common Prayer, which Book of Common Worship, excuse me, which is our worship book, lots of stuff we take from there. There is prayers for other people groups. And so Muslims is one of those, and this is the prayer that they encourage us to pray by saying, this is something appropriate to say in church, for example. And this is what it says. It says, Eternal God, you are the one God to be worshipped by all. The one called Allah by your Muslim children, descendants of Abraham as we are. Give us grace to hear your truth in the teachings of Muhammad the Prophet, and to show your love as disciples of Jesus Christ, that Christians and Muslims together may serve you in faith and friendship. Right, like right there, what does this say? Well, this is like exactly what Paul is warning about in 2 Corinthians. Because what's happened is people who have brought a teaching have molded or melded Islam into Christianity by saying, there really isn't that big of a difference. Muhammad's a prophet. Like, we certainly don't believe Muhammad's a prophet. I don't know why we would think that. Muhammad, one of the prophecies he receives, says that Jesus isn't the Son of God, and that he didn't die on the cross, right? I'm sorry, that's not what we believe as Christians. That's not a good prophecy. That would be that's like in the Bible, right, where it says like, hey, if you've received a prophecy that goes against this, like that's not from God, and if anyone would say that, you would kick them out of the church, right? And so we certainly don't believe Muhammad's a prophet. We certainly don't believe that we are just as legitimate, or Muslims are just as legitimate a break of the Abrahamic faith tree as we are, right? That's just not what Christians believe, which is fine, right? Muslims don't have to believe that we're as legitimate as they are either. I'm not saying like this is the thing, is we want such a pluralistic atmosphere that I think the reason that people push back against Eid Mubarak, people wishing each other happy holidays in different cultures, is because they're so worried that there's going to be compromise like this, right? This is what Paul is warning about in 2 Corinthians. And so you have to be very clear, and this is why, for me, there's a difference between personal life and public facing life, right? Personal life, hey, I live next door to a Muslim, they wished me Eid Mubarak, it's okay. You can wish them Eid Mubarak back, right? Because in your personal life, you're able to have a relationship with them, and they're able to understand what you believe and things like that. On the public facing sphere, you have to be very clear about what you believe versus other faiths and teachings and stuff like that. And so we have to be, as a church, clear that, hey, we don't celebrate Eid. We don't think that Islam is the right faith. And again, I know that like for a lot of people to get offended when we talk like that. Don't, right? I mean, ask yourself, like, if there is anything such as a truth statement, then you have to be fine with people disagreeing with you, right? Like, you can disagree, you can debate, things like that. But you don't have to compromise. And so here, right, this is compromise, and this is what Paul is warning against in 2 Corinthians. And so that's what we want to be careful with. And so what I would say is personal life, it's fine to be generous and charitable to your friends, to wish them holidays and things like that. You definitely want to do so in a way, like you definitely in your own life want to make clear what you believe, because otherwise it could just be empty pluralism. But at the same time, we have to be very clear from a organizational standpoint about what is true and what isn't. And a lot of mainline churches fail at the second part. While they're really good at loving people in the sense of making them feel included and welcomed and stuff, they're usually pretty bad at really actually being able to tell the differences between things, which ends up making the faith really hollow and compromised. So we want to be careful about that. So I hope this has been interesting to you. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. I'm gonna be gone for 2 weeks, so I'll see you guys in May. Enjoy the time without me. You know, so yeah, it'll be good to get a break. I hope all of you have a wonderful Thursday. Peace out.